The committee will come to order. Members will take their seats. The chair would like to announce for the benefit of members on both sides that as we go through the 114th Congress, the chair will look most favorably on the amendments offered by members who managed to show up to votes on a timely basis. Members on both sides of the aisle may wish to take note of Chairman's Protocol number 1407. The pending business is the resolution to adopt rules of the Committee on Financial Services pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the House of Representatives, upon which the previous question has been ordered. The clerk will designate the resolution.
To adopt the rules of the Committee on Financial Services pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the House of Representatives.
The question is on agreeing to the resolution. Those in favor say aye. 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 Let's try it again. Aye. Those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I seek recognition to ask for a roll call.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in favor of taking a recorded vote will raise their hands to be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. King. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett, aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer, aye. Mr. McHenry. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Westmoreland. Mr. Westmoreland, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Hurt. Mr. Hurt, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Fincher. Mr. Fincher, aye. Mr. Stutzman. Mr. Stutzman, aye. Mr. Mulvaney. Mr. Mulvaney, aye. Mr. Holgren. Mr. Holgren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Mr. Dole. Mr. Dole, aye. Mr. Ginta. Mr. Ginta, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, no. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Hinojosa. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Carney. Mr. Carney, no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, no. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, no. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 31 and the nays are 21.
A majority of members having voted to agree to the resolution, the resolution is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to the resolution just adopted, I offer a resolution to name Republican members of the committee to subcommittees of the committee and for other purposes. I move its adoption. Members have a copy of this resolution at their desk. The clerk will report the resolution.
To name Republican members to the committee and to subcommittees of the committee and for other purposes.
Without objection, the resolution is considered read, and without objection, the resolution is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I congratulate all of my colleagues on their appointments. There being no further business before the committee, we stand adjourned.